Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we are joined by Kilian Kleinschmidt, CEO of Switchboard. Kilian, thank you so much for joining the show.
Hi. Well, thanks for inviting me and giving me that opportunity.
Absolutely. So for our guests who are not familiar with Kilian, he is an innovator in the field of refugees and new communities surrounding them. And it's especially a field that isn't really prone to innovation. And normally on the show, as our listeners know, we usually talk about strictly the content or the theory or the nitty-gritty practice of working with zones and new communities. But Kilian's story is so interesting. I would like to ask a couple questions and have him illustrate some of his conclusions based on his story. So, Kilian, can you first tell me the beginning of, not necessarily your career, but the beginning of your professional life first started by working in a co-op in Germany?
Well, wrong. I worked in a co-op in France.
Oh, sorry, my apologies.
Actually, before working in the co-op in France, I was raising goats and making goat cheese. I finished my secondary school in Germany, in Berlin, and then I moved to France, ended up in an abandoned region, and this has sort of marked and really impregnated, if you want, my pathway, in a region which was totally abandoned by young people. So the typical immigration area in the Pyrenees in southern France, average age 60 years, no economy, very backwards, not much happening, really, really sad in a way. And so we settled there with romantic dreams of whatever. And so the first step was goats. The second step was saying, well, revival and goes through economy. And we found that there was nothing there to really support people. And so we were basically the migrants people hated. And because we were different, people from all over France and Europe and so on, living in that abandoned area. It was cheap and very beautiful. And so we set up a cooperative which provided services, which provided building services. So I'm a roofer by profession. And so that was sort of a very successful project, which led, in fact, to a total revival of that region, sustainable tourism, jobs. We gave jobs to people who wanted to settle, setting up all sorts of production units, financing cultural activities. So we were, in fact, a social enterprise used to revive an area. So that was the start of it. And then I decided I wanted to learn how to ride a motorbike, and I went through the Sahara to Mali. And that was my first encounter by accident in a bar. I met some people working on a development humanitarian project in the north, roughly in the region of Timbuktu. And that's where I encountered the NGO world, the humanitarian world, a different type that I didn't know yet. And I discovered that I was not always very professional, and we will come back to this at a later stage. And that sort of made me to think, well, now I want to save the world. And then started applying, and suddenly was sent by an NGO, recruited by an NGO to Uganda, set up a vocational training center. And also there, I introduced pretty much from the beginning in this post-war zone, which were the killing fields of Uganda in the civil war. It was in 1988, so we're talking a while ago. Where, again, youth was totally without perspectives. People were traumatized by what has happened. Thousands of people had been killed. And so we set up the vocational training center, and it basically served as a hub. Today you would call something like this a hub, as a hub to revive the area, do reconstruction work, be a sort of the social center for everyone where people could come together. And then again, by accident, met some people from the UN, started in 91 to work for the UN in Southern Sudan. And that's where basically then my story with displacement started. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Southern Sudanese in that time by tribal fighting, but of course also by the war with the North. And here, that sort of suddenly I was pushed out with 20,000 Southern Sudanese, the lost boys of Southern Sudan, where a lot of them actually ended up in the United States being resettled and so on later on. I ended up with 20,000 of them moving into Kenya one night because we were attacked. And that night, basically these 20,000 became refugees, and I started working with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, that night, and setting up my first camp. I had no clue of how to set up camps. So that was the beginning of a long career in the, let's say, humanitarian disaster world, dealing with, at times, millions of displaced people in Pakistan, Somalia. I was in Somalia during the horrible events of '93, the fighting which took place there, Black Hawk Down. That day I was in Mogadishu. So yeah, so a career which led me until 2014 to work for the United Nations.
It reads like an adventure story. There's even one account of you repairing an old rail line and taking a steam-powered train to transport Congolese refugees to another location.
Well, they were not Congolese refugees, they were from Rwanda, had fled into the rainforest. And that's, again, one of these stories where my mission was to find them because, I mean, they were in fact the people who had committed to a large extent the genocide and their families. So it was a tricky thing. So they escaped from the Rwandan army and they fled into the rainforest, deep into the rainforest. But still, I mean, still human beings. And so the mission was find them and do something. That was the mission. And so, yeah, we eventually found them after a while in repairing an old train, an old colonial train, which was used to bypass the rapids on the Congo River of Kisangani. And yeah, we found them, but terrible state, cholera outbreaks, and lots of people continuously being killed. We witnessed probably the killing of roughly 25,000 people, more or less in front of us. And we ended up in organizing a very big airlift of 45,000 people back to Rwanda at the time, which was for them the preferred solution rather than being killed, as they said, like animals in the rainforest.
So what have these large initiatives, what have they taught you about large-scale logistics and dealing with chaotic situations?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think what we tend to, well, maybe at the time I was still enthusiastic about the sort of idea of saving lives, and yeah, probably I've contributed to save lots of lives. But in the end, well, you discover you are just a little piece in the whole big game of big powers and what they negotiate and want and do. That's one thing. That in fact a logistic response may be the right thing in times of crisis. I mean, you have millions of people in front of you and they need some survival aid. That's logical. I mean, shelter, water, all the things you need to actually survive the next 24 hours, and you have to work very fast. That's okay. But where this whole thing comes to really a quick end in being effective is when it goes to what I would call today beyond survival. The concept of beyond survival is something very important. I mean, this is what humanity is about, and that's what many people in this world today cannot realize. They're struggling with survival every day. And that's where the humanitarian system, the development system as such, has still very few responses at scale and is not really equipped to deal with that. And that's where innovation and innovative partnerships become very important. And of course, there is expressions of places which are particularly showing this failure. This is the whole modern concept of refugee camps, for instance, which is sort of the symbol for forced displacement. The utmost sort of expression of the failure of finding solutions, is a camp where you store people for the next 20 years until you dust them a bit and bring them back.
So I think a perfect example would be to talk about your tenure as well, as you recall, the mayor of the Satari refugee camp in Jordan. Can you sort of explain how those lessons that you were just talking about tie into your experience there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I came out of a mission where I was the humanitarian coordinator for Mogadishu, deputy humanitarian coordinator for Somalia, and it was very tough. And then the High Commissioner asked me to go to Jordan because they couldn't fix the situation in Jordan. There was a refugee camp established in 2012 for the Syrian refugees coming to Jordan. Thousands came every night across the border. And as of July 2012, they established this camp called Zatari, 10 kilometers from the border. And that's where the system responded very well. I mean, there was not a day without people having been supplied with, again, the survival tents and food and water and toilets and all that, and health. But somehow there was a constant rebellion against the aid organizations, against the Jordanian security forces in charge of security. It went to a very high level of violence, an extremely high level of violence, and so they didn't know what to do anymore. And that's when I was sent there in early 2013 to basically, with a mission, do something about the situation. And that where I discovered very fast that we had a total disconnect between the people, which we saw only as numbers, as a logistic challenge, and their urge to be recognized as persons, as human beings, as individuals with desires, with that urge to, in fact, to recover their personality. And personality is expressed, interestingly, not always by community. So we have in the humanitarian system, we have this concept, everything is community-based. And so we had established, for instance, communal latrines, kitchens, and showers and so on. And all what the people did was dismantling them and using the materials to establish their own latrines and toilets, their own showers, and their own kitchens. As well, we had sort of laid out, of course, the usual standard grid of a storage camp for people. People moved the tents around. Later on, the ISO boxes, the containers, which were supplied and donated by many, and they moved them around, and they actually started establishing homesteads and so on. And so I discovered that we had two totally different visions of the place. So we had this storage sort of logistic challenge in mind and basically saying, hooray, we managed. And they considered this as their living space. They considered this as a space which they're increasingly sort of captured as their new homes away from home. And so it was crucial to actually bring peace in there. And it took us exactly 12 months to do so. So out of a very violent camp where people got injured and even a police officer killed, another one had his head smashed and is still in a coma, I believe. I mean, what happened was this violence, we turned around into something with I would say, a living space which, with all its limitations, became something where, yes, my nickname became the mayor, and it became, in a way, a city, which of course is not the narrative one would like to use when you talk about refugee camps, because there is a very dogmatic approach to this today, and this is, I think it's a wrongly understood concept. It's what I call the myth of return. So we're talking about these people as, well, all what they want is to return. Yeah, well, they want to return eventually to recover their properties. They want to recover their rights. That's very legitimate and should be like that. But at the same time, people transform and change. They become, when they move into such big agglomerations like this camp of Zatari with 100,000, today about 80,000 people, they become urbanized. And this is really sort of the fact which we observe all over the world, is that this transformation of people in exile, in displacement, is not recognized.
And this has really terrible legal consequences. A lot of different refugee camps around the world, they don't even recognize the right of refugees to empower themselves economically. They have to rely on aid. They can't set up their own properties or their own businesses, and as a consequence, they're just kind of dependent. Is that a problem that you've seen in camps, or is that something that's been addressed or in the Zatari refugee camp as well?
Well, I mean, again, so this misconception is that that you have people who are there for a limited time. And everything is built up on that concept. It's a limited time, so it's a temporary thing. And so, and that's where the whole problem starts, and that's where I sort of increasingly also started realizing, well, again, this personal transformation which takes place, that need of people to have their individuality recognized, their personality, their identity recognized, is not respected at all in this whole environment in which we work, if we talk about humanitarian or development agency approaches. And that's where we need to look into what is, in fact, the sustainable way of dealing with these shifts of populations, without, again, endorsing the reasons why they get displaced.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's this this sort of non-permanent mentality that has the refugee camp as this great planner, and you have the refugees as sort of objects. But as you're mentioning, that they're going about their own lives and managing their own lives. There's even accounts of them setting up unofficial power companies, setting up their own infrastructure and empowering the camp without the original consent of yourself and other people managing the camp on the UN side, correct?
Yeah, I mean, what happened was that we established, because there was no money, not enough money, to establish individual power connections. If you take this example. And so what they did was they looked at the public lighting and of course then organized themselves, and there were about 250 electricians in the camp, and they organized themselves in selling connections, illegal connections to the power lines, which of course then caused a lot of problems with the capacity of the system, of the transformers and so on. And we had, I mean, this is no joke, a monthly bill of up to $800,000 which had to be paid by the UN, by UNHCR through its humanitarian budget. And of course, that was not budgeted for. Now, the logic of the humanitarian side is to say, well, this shouldn't be, while the other logic is to say, well, after all, if you have 100,000 people, they spend $800,000, this is only $8 a person a month, and what it produces is quality of life, safety, economy. And here leading to the famous Champs-Élysées. Champs is the word for Syria. Champs-Élysées, of course, linked to the Champs-Élysées in Paris, with over 3,000 shops being established. Quite often joint ventures between Syrian refugees and Jordanian business people who knew each other from before even the war. And these shops, again, they were the expression of life, because they provided things which, again, the humanitarian system would not provide in distributions. You don't want to eat the same stuff for the next 20 years. You don't want to clothe yourself like everybody else. So interestingly, the shops which then came up had things like interior design items, clothing material, of course. There were restaurants, there even pet shops, because Syrians like to establish, they like to have a bird cage or something, and they like to build fountains in their inner courtyards, which is part of a cooling system, but also an expression of home. So lots of these materials and equipment were brought in, and then that created the whole economy, where we estimated at about $10 to $15 million turnover a month. And that is how cities are actually beginning to grow.
Wow, it definitely seems like a very interesting case study about what people do when they congregate in large areas and how they take on a life of their own, and they need to be treated as such. So you worked at the camp for almost 2 years, and then you left the UN afterwards. After you departed from that post, what was your impression about the potential solutions to these problems that you observed in other refugee camps and the ones in Zataria?
Let's recall, we always, when you talk about refugees, first of all, if you take this on a global scale, the number of refugees is maybe very high, and it's certainly the highest ever. However, it's to be seen in the whole context of desperate migration, in the context of people on the move at large throughout the world, moving into spaces where they hope to find a better life and so on, and quite often into informal settlements. We'll come to that later. Refugee camps are by no means, in fact, with about 2 million or so people living in refugee camps today, are not the rule, they're the exception. So let's keep that in mind. Most people live outside of refugee camps. The observation is that, of course, if you look into the statistics of last year, and we're coming back to this issue of returns, I think it's only 380,000 people or so worldwide are considered as refugees having returned to their countries, while a much larger number got displaced and moved into a host country, or into other safer areas in their own country as internally displaced persons. The response of the international community, if you want, is to say, because of the principles, we don't endorse displacement, the causes of displacement, we don't endorse ethnic cleansing and whatnot, and that's right. But at the same time, then to hold people, in fact, in a way hostage to that situation is also not right. So seen from outside, the response in these holding centers basically is certainly the wrong one. And that's when I started looking into what is in fact the origin, excuse me, what is actually the origin of our cities. And in fact, cities are grown out of being safe havens and places of new perspectives for people. And all our cities have a history of migration. You are in the US, obviously that's clear. It's an immigration country. Lots of people came because of looking for new lives and so on. Every city there is built out of migrants. In Europe, the transformation from rural populations moving into cities, again, linked very much to insecurity. So I was once in Venice for an event, and it occurred to me that Venice was in fact a big refugee camp, because it was built by people to protect themselves against the barbarians and others devastating the countryside on the mainland. That's how Venice came up. So why don't we, and this is when sort of these ideas started growing, why don't we begin to look into refugee camps as settlements and in an approach of transformation into more sustainable urban spaces? And a number of countries are actually applying this in a way. I mean, if you look into Uganda, which is one of the big refugee hosting countries in the world, Uganda, which has allowed for settlements to be established. And these are pretty sort of semi-permanent buildings, which are coming up in a way people are allowed to farm and so on. So that is a new approach to deal with that phenomenon that people will probably stay rather than go.
Interesting. And you've since your post at the UN, you've started working with a bunch of different initiatives towards this end. You partnered with Michael Casamiller, who founded Refugee Cities, and he's been on the show before. And you're currently working with him on a concept called sustainable development zones. Do you want to sort of explain that and how that relates to some of the solutions that you outlined?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, it all, I mean, maybe for me personally, it didn't start with Zatari. It was also some work we started doing in Kenya in the Dadaab camp at the time, which I called as a working title, by the way, the city of Dadaabia. Again, looking into the transformation of people becoming more urbanized than urban dwellers. So moving into the direction of understanding refugee camps as cities of the future, recognizing the fact that probably in most cases they will stay for a long time, and it would be a waste of resources to look only into temporary structures. My first refugee camp in Kenya, which is Kakuma refugee camp, which hosts today roughly 200,000 people. That's the one which I established when I came with the Lost Boys. It still exists since 1992. And so we need to apply different planning parameters into these spaces which are not temporary anymore. And that's where urban planning capacity comes in. And so again, for Zatari, we started working, for instance, with the city of Amsterdam. We worked with the Municipal Association of the Netherlands on helping not only Zatari camp, but also the municipalities highly affected by a major influx of people living and basically drawing on the resources. So we came up with this sort of first approach of, well, we should look at these spaces as settlements, as cities, and we should apply different planning parameters. So that was the beginning, in a way, was also then Michael used to when he founded Refugee Cities. In Jordan, and interestingly, that sort of concept then moved in a direction where the so-called Jordan Compact, decided in 2016, which was an international agreement, and the government of Jordan was ready through special economic zones to provide work and work permits to Syrian refugees living in the country. And so there we also already moved in the direction of connecting that urban concept with the concept of special economic zones. So refugee cities on one hand, recognizing camps have in fact an urban character, need to be designed differently. And then moving into combining that with the concept of special zones. That was sort of the nascent idea. And then came a moment when, together with Michael and Dr. Joachim Rücke, who is a former very senior diplomat, German diplomat, we actually worked after my UN career. We worked in 2017. I was asked by the Chancellor of Austria, the Prime Minister of Austria, to develop a strategy or to look into the migration dimension on the African continent. So we worked on a study which we called Africa from Crisis to Opportunity, where we looked into the real migration challenge and how the European Union and Austria was supposed to become, was then later on the presidents of the European Union, could do something more sustainable than just basically building walls on the Mediterranean and trying to prevent people. So what is the real approach? And then, yeah, discovering that the real challenge, the real global challenge, of course, is this massive urbanization which is taking place. I mean, we all know, at least in the sector, we know that in 2050, 70% of the world's population, that means 3 billion more than today, will be living in urban centers throughout the world. And so how do you respond to that? And again, this is a mishmash and mix of totally different types of people, where it becomes impossible in this mixed migration of people running away from climate change related agricultural reduction of production to less opportunities because there are no services, to whatnot, mixed with internally displacement because of crisis, mixed with refugee movements, and they all move into cities. And that's when we then, in that study, Africa from Crisis to Opportunity, began to really offer the model, which we had to a certain extent already developed, of sustainable development zones, which is very much leaned on some of the other concepts in that field, but it's different.
So what have been some updates in that initiative, or case studies that people can look at when looking into the concept of sustainable development zones?
Well, first of all, maybe very quickly on the basic concept. I mean, we looked into, of course, the concept of charter cities. We looked into the different models which have been developed around that, and we said, well, we want to look particularly at the issue of informality, reducing informality for these mixed communities, which is the big issue. I mean, so informality is a big issue. So these are poor people usually. So we don't look at, we look less at greenfield developments, we look more at brownfield developments, in the sense we look into peri-urban areas where you have usually sort of the landing point for these people coming from all sorts of different origins and sides and so on into the cities. We then said, well, we need to be different because we want to have a bottom-up approach. We want to actually establish the special zones with the same basically special charter as has been talked about, but as a social enterprise, socially driven, social impact driven. So we have for those interested in that, we have developed a whole governance concept with inclusion of the residents into the governance structure. They become shareholders, etc. So in that sense, we're different. We really look at these spaces, really particularly on these new cities coming out of the special development zone approach, as the most effective way to reduce informality in these settings. And informality goes through secure land tenure, then to ownership of the dwellings, or secure rental of the dwellings, to then of course being able to register businesses and so on, reduce the barriers to the extent possible.
So that's very unique, the framework that you just listed out. Normally with special zones, they're either public or private. Public, they're government run, and private, it's run by a for-profit company. In either cases, rarely do zones allow, except for like in cases where there are already residents, like in Shenzhen or Hong Kong, or even in those cases, there's very little feedback from the local community in terms of governance. Could you explain a little bit about what that feedback looks, the concept of them being shareholders in the project, how they would provide feedback, et cetera?
Well, I mean, we have developed a whole sort of basic generic concept, which of course needs to be adapted to the different environments. But we're talking about setting up that sort of, the developer is a public-private citizens entity, which is ideally co-owned by basically the developer, investor. The municipality should come in, as well as we said, the residents. There should be an oversight committee where you can raise your complaints and so on. and of course, decisions to the extent possible are made as on the basis of that structure. We do not look into these spaces as high-end developments, as quite often is the case for tech cities or other things which are developed. It really would allow that somebody sets up a very basic little house. But again, because of the secure land tenure, then there should be access to financing, saving schemes, whatnot, so that you build on eventually building code and so on. You're improving the value, you're raising the value of the land. And so there is a growth in that, and it doesn't become just another slum, which is simply co-owned by everybody. So there is an evolution in there. Of course, you can use that as an incubator for bringing in new skills, for better education, for health. You can be as innovative as it gets to all these different elements. We look into, of course, for such a zone to become financially, also socially and economically really sustainable. We look into at least 200 to 300 hectares, ideally up to, 1,000 or more, to become a size which becomes an entity which is sustainable. So that is sort of the basic concept.
Very interesting. I could definitely see a lot of use cases for this because of, as you mentioned, people are becoming a lot more mobile and sometimes involuntarily so. So having this model where they can, one, economically empower themselves, they aren't dependent on a host jurisdiction, but also it sounds like being politically active in a sense and being stakeholders in the rising value of the city that they co-create together. And when I'm thinking about this example, I can't help but think about what's happening in Hong Kong right now, and this idea that the Hong Kong people are losing their political and legal rights as we speak. And there's even talk about setting up a new Hong Kong elsewhere, a place where Hong Kong people can go around the world and set up their own sort of new Hong Kongs. Would your organization be interested in helping Hong Kong residents find a new home?
Yeah, that would be certainly a potential for sure. But maybe let me explain a concrete project we're working on, because that's sort of, I think it's a perfect example for the challenge which could be, or the challenges which could be addressed by that. And this is Ethiopia. So we started in late 2018 this was in conjunction with UN Habitat. We were asked to look into solutions for internal displacement in Ethiopia. And there's a few 100,000 displaced, well, actually more than 1 million displaced people in Ethiopia because of different reasons of conflict over land, over ethnic conflict, development sort of the related conflicts in a country with a big growth rate, both in terms of population, but also in terms of economy. And so very fast, we found out that the real challenge is maybe not this million or plus people internally displaced, and there shouldn't be a standalone solution for them, but that the real challenge in a country of 100 million people is that currently 21% live in an urban center, but in a few years from now, it will be 40% of 140 million people. And again, sort of this, what we already had found before in the study we carried out throughout the continent, we said, okay, so why don't we apply that SDZ special zone approach? Why don't we run this through the local mayors and so on? In this case, we looked into 3 municipalities in the outskirts of Addis Ababa, which is one of these fast-growing population centers. And yes, that was by all felt to be the right solution to move forward and to avoid just an sort of uncontrollable growth of informal settlements where you have to sort of mixed population. Some of the more regular farmers would be subletting and so on. So we came up with a proposal in this pre-feasibility study to develop a few new cities in Ethiopia as special development zones. And we actually finally, after sort of lots of backs and forth, will be returning this autumn to conduct a stakeholder consultation, and we'll be looking into moving this project further. So that's a very concrete example of a project where we are looking obviously for partners who would actually be interested in joining this journey, also to help when carrying out the full feasibility and moving into establishing the in fact the social enterprises required once we have fixed the locations and have the buy-in by the stakeholders. So it's a very concrete example. But coming back to Hong Kong, yes, of course. I mean, it's very, very doable to use the same approach.
Excellent. It's super exciting to hear that there's already concrete progress on the ground. One potential concern that pretty much everyone in the zone industry, or everyone in general, is what will be the effect of COVID, or what will happen in a post-COVID world to these projects. Do you believe that a post-COVID world will slow down migrations as governments begin to clamp down, or will they accelerate migrations voluntarily and involuntarily as a consequence of the virus and the economic and social fallout?
Well, I honestly, I think it will be really an acceleration of this process. I mean, I live and work, and I speak to you now from Tunisia, where certainly, I mean, COVID as such hasn't hit hard in terms of the disease, but it has hit hard, very hard in terms of economy. Total collapse, of course, I mean, one of the pillars of economy here is tourism. Total collapse for the time being. Although again, we had basically no cases or very few cases. And so the outfall for particularly the poorer sections of the society with very little social protection are tremendous. So I really think we will see a lot of movement around that. Of course, here the feeling of being trapped in the country and not being able to move to Europe to better perspectives and so on is always an issue. But also within the country, we will see changes, and that will be the case everywhere. So we will see a lot of this poverty-related search for new opportunities in a post-COVID world. And that requires robust answers, because if we don't address this, I mean, as I'm saying, business as usual is no option. So it needs to be addressed. It needs to be really linked with. But coming to the concerns, I think the real concern is somewhere else, and where we have found the largest opposition to our proposals, which is linked to basically taking out special zones out of the national context, or privatizing cities it's a red flag for many people. And that has been if we want the major blocker so far is the lack of endorsement of the fact that, well, we need, and these special zones should be seen as well as a lab for governments to exactly deal with their challenges, their social challenges, with the challenge of informality. 80% in some countries of the economy are informal. Well, that's for sure a big challenge, and because people can't overcome the hurdles. So it's even more urgent to be more bold and take eventually certain risks in coming up with solutions which deal with larger number of people. We can't play around anymore. And COVID is, I think, a big wake-up call that we need to move much faster, particularly when it comes to this challenge.
Wow, it sounds like the work that you're doing is really focusing on a lot of large scale trends, and it's kind of converging on a moment. So it's providing a large opportunity for your organization and people that are working in this field. For our listeners, what are ways, as we conclude the podcast, what are some ways that they can support or learn about your organization and the work that you're doing?
Well, I mean, first of all, we do have created, we have changed the name of Refugee Cities, and we call it now the SDZ Alliance. So you will find also a website which is called sdzalliance.org. So that's the first step if you want to keep track and get in touch with us. Secondly, what we really need, and this is to be very frank and very direct, we certainly need support, financial support, to get this moving forward. It's very slow because of these concerns one would have and so on, particularly interestingly from the humanitarian side, lots of questions. So we need certainly somebody who would, or partners who would accompany us in this journey and work together with us in securing the necessary finance to get the models further developed, to get the pilot projects, Ethiopia and others, move forward. There's potential need in a number of countries. And again, when we speak with the mayors, when we speak with the policymakers, there is high interest because they don't know how to move with this. I mean, how is the mayor of Lagos dealing with 1 million people more every year, or others? So and that you can translate up to the smaller municipalities. So that's what we really need is working together on securing the necessary financing to be able to really show that, well, it's one of the options. It's an exciting option. It's an option which addresses millions of people, and particularly the ones who usually are not addressed in this type of projects, new cities, new societies as such. They fall under the radar screen. And then, of course, when we move to the implementation level, I see every of these spaces as a massive opportunity for really introducing innovative ways of governance, innovative ways of technology transfer, new skills, moving and really helping to leapfrog some of the mistakes and the shortcomings of our own societies.
Wow. Well, everyone, if you are interested in helping people or having an impact in the world and having an adventure, maybe very similar to Kilian here, please check them out. Try to see if you can support them. And everyone, thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Kilian, thank you so much for joining the show.
Well, thanks, Joe, and love to continue relating and working with you.
Of course. Thank you so much.